Seem to be present. The plastic parts are still sealed in their original plastic bag. They are moulded in smooth silver plastic, which appears to be somewhat harder than plastic used today. The details are reasonable, with mostly raised panel lines being present, but there are some recessed details too. The components are reasonably well formed, with some flash and moulding marks being present. The 37 components are held on 4 sprues, although some parts had fallen off, but fortunately were still present in the bag. Additionally, the cockpit canopy is moulded in clear plastic, with a representation of the canopy frames moulded on. Again, this part was loose in the bag, and no other clear parts were included. Before starting the construction, the plastic parts were given a wash in warm soapy water. This will help remove any dirt or oil left over from the moulding process and give a good clean surface for the paint and cement to stick to. I then left them to air dry. The fuselage halves were then cut from the sprues with a sharp knife. Any burrs, rough areas or unwanted plastic was then sanded off with a nail file. I tested the fit of the fuselage to see how well it would go together. The internal components, the parts for the cockpit and the joint for the elevators on the tail, were then added inside the fuselage halves. I'm using Tamiya extra thin cement throughout this build due to its good flow and bonding properties, and the applicator brush in the lid allows for accurate placement of the cement. The fuselage halves were then cemented together. I then removed the nose of the aircraft from the sprue and cleaned it up. I was ready to add this to the model, but then I realised that I had forgotten to add weight inside the fuselage. As I intended to model the aircraft with the wheels down, a lack of weight in the nose would cause it to tip backwards and sit on its tail. I carefully opened the two halves of the fuselage up again, and then glued some small coins as far forward of the main landing gear as I could. The fuselage was then cemented back together again and the nose added. The elevators were the next parts to be added to the model, again removing them from their sprues, cleaning them up and cementing them in place. I believe that if you are careful, the elevators can be made to pivot in a realistic fashion, but I was not too bothered about this and just fixed them in place. The wings come in two parts which need cementing together. Some work was required in order to get them to fit snugly. When complete, each wing slots into the fuselage of the model, but again required some attention in order to get them to fit correctly. The underslung fuel tank comes in two halves and had to be cemented together. It is fairly easy, and the fit is reasonable. The pylon which attaches it to the bottom of the fuselage is cemented into the groove in the top of the tank. The missiles are simply removed from their sprues, cleaned up and then cemented onto their respective hardpoint pylons as well. The probe, which projects from the nose of the aircraft, was then added to the model. This part fits into a pre-molded hole in the nose. The landing gear came next. This step is a little fiddly. First, a landing gear cover is cemented into position. I blindly followed the instructions for this part, and after completing the model, I realized they were actually drawn wrong. They are shown in the landing gear raised position, but with the landing gear down. They should in fact be in a more open position, folded down towards the ground. Mildly annoying, as I feel the instruction writers over at Frog should have got this right, but either way, it's something I can live with. The wheels are added to the landing gear legs by inserting the prong into the hole in the wheel. This is a little longer than it needs to be and has to be cut off. The leg is then finished off by cementing it into the hole in the bottom of the wing. You might have to hold this in place as it dries. The nose wheel is simple to install, inserting the wheel between the two prongs and then cementing in place. It can then be added to the correct hole in the nose. The air brake is then cemented into the fuselage. If you want to, you can position it open or closed. The nose bay doors were then added to the correct positions. This is a little difficult, so tweezers might be a useful tool here. This was then followed by the door parts, which attach to the landing gear legs. This is also a little fiddly. The missiles and fuel tank, which were previously assembled, can now be added to their relevant positions on the bottom side of the model. They locate into holes moulded into the plastic. They may need to be held in place to prevent them from drooping to one side. Next, the antenna, which fits just behind the cockpit, is added. Again, this cements into a pre-moulded hole. At this point, I'm now ready to start painting. I'm using Humbrol Metal Coat Polished Aluminium number 27032. I use this straight out of the pot, but you can thin it if you prefer. Thinning your paint will help prevent visible brush strokes, but this paint is quite thin already and has a long drying time. A few coats of this paint will be required in order to give a uniform overall finish. The cockpit canopy was also given a few coats of this paint, taking care to only apply it to the moulded framework. I did this carefully by hand using a fine paintbrush. Following this, when the previous layers had completely cured, I gave the entire model a coat of Humbrol 135 acrylic satin varnish. This was thinned with a little water to help minimize brush strokes. This satin varnish will become the base for the decals and will help prevent the silvering that can occur when applying decals onto more matte finishes. This was then left to dry before the application of the decals. Humbrol Matte Black Acrylic No. 33 was then used to paint the cockpit areas. The cockpit is very lacking in detail, and you might be able to notice that I've decided to not use the pilot figure. I thought he was quite crudely moulded and it would detract from the overall appearance of the model. Painting this entire area black will help to hide the lack of details. Whilst I was using this paint, the wheels are also given a coat to depict the tyres. A few coats were needed, taking care to not get paint on any areas that were meant to stay silver. This step would have been easier if the landing gear was not already cemented in place, but I persevered and achieved reasonable results. The jet exhaust nozzle was given a coat of Humbrol 53 acrylic gunmetal grey, again taking care to only apply it where needed. A few coats of